I am John Asack, and this is the brilliant and wonderful Hoyt Richards, my great good friend. Hi, Hoyt.
Hey, John, how are you? Good to see you
I'm
as
good.
always.
Yeah, now you've got to live up to the introduction.
Oh, I know, my goodness. Yeah, that actually reminds me of the way the cult leader would introduce us. He had a way of inflating you in front of other people that, was this exaggerated version of yourself that on one level you liked it,
Mm,
but on the other level you knew you're being misrepresented. So it was a real push-pull that he put you in right from the get-go. So yeah, I am
yeah.
familiar. I'm familiar with the technique. Yeah,
Well, I mean what I say,
I
and
know you
and
are.
I'm
Yeah.
sticking to it.
Okay, well done. Well, it's a mutual admiration society.
Yeah, definitely. And let's keep up with that. It's good for us.
Yeah.
Um, so Oliver Wendell Holmes, the thing about friends forming mutual admiration societies. I think it started with him. He was a bit of a weirdo, actually, but we won't get into that. He's famous for the things he said, but not his Supreme Court rulings quite so much, I don't
Well,
think.
yeah. Do as I say, not as I do. Right.
Mm,
I think
yeah,
that's
it's a,
one of the challenges with parenthood. You're always telling kids, "Well, don't do what I did. It got me in trouble." But it's like, dude, and kids are like, "Well, you did it." I mean, it's a quagmire, I'm sure.
I like John Gottman's advice on that. I'm very, over the years, been very impressed with John Gottman, and that's not true of all psychologists, I must say. And that he says, when your kid has trouble, then think about a time when you screwed up in the same way and tell them that story.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree with that approach. I think because when you're looking at it from the point of view that these are the trials or tribulations that I went through to arrive where I am now, why would I want to deprive my child of a similar trial by fire in order to, how are they going to arrive to the place where I'm happy, like where I am, if they don't have their own challenges? So I can understand the desire to want to, protect your children from conflict, but I mean, my goodness, it just seems to be the only way we learn,
Yeah,
right?
and I think it's a major way that we learn. I'm told that Sufis pray for hardship because
Yeah.
that is. But I think we probably can learn from books, and I'm hoping
Oh,
from
yeah.
podcasts.
Yes. Oh, I agree. And actually that's a great segue because I have a book that I wanted to talk about on our podcast right now.
There we go.
It's called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, and and he wrote The Perfect Storm and some other great books. He's a really interesting guy. But I got turned on to him through a mutual friend, and what I found is the book is all about kind of tribal communities and the role they play in societies and through history. And what I discovered, because the friend who gave it to me recommended that there might be things in it that I found that he thought I would find relevant to my cultic experience, and that was exactly the case. And so I wanted to kind of go through. I made some notes, and we'll kind of go through them. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it because I thought it was interesting. So I mean, the basic premise, the way the book starts, is just elaborating that as America was being settled, uh, you had the Native American community, and then you had the Westerners, and there was really only one direction that people would migrate from one culture to the other, and that was for the Westerners going into the tribal communities of the Native American Indians.
Which often
And
happened. Yeah.
yeah, it did happen a lot, and it was because they had a much what they discovered, and what he talks about in the book is that type of individual would find a greater sense of community within the tribal community because you when you look at the Western world and how we can kind of accumulate wealth and position, it's because of the isolated nature of the way the society has built, even more extreme so to where we are now, like the civilized world. But when you're in a tribal kind of nomadic community, you can only carry as much as you have. That's all that you have is what you can carry, more or less. So it's a very even playing field, and you only really survive based on everyone looking out for each other. Obviously, if you're going to be greedy, you're going to get reprimanded. If you're not pulling your weight, you're going to be reprimanded. So there's this kind of self-correcting checks and balances that exist, and then there's this real sense of purpose because if everyone's not pulling their weight, the team can lose, so to speak. And so that was a big draw to a lot of people who felt they lacked purpose in their lives within the emerging Western community. So that's kind of how he starts the story, which I thought was really fascinating. And he poses questions like, how do you become an adult in society that doesn't ask for sacrifice? How do you become a man in the world that doesn't require courage? Because we get kind of insulated within the civilized world of whether it's policemen or the army or whatever, they all have their roles. So the ways in the tribal community where you have to kind of go out and be initiated, a ritual, and kind of prove your bravery or courage, those haven't really existed in the Western world in a long time. And that's a real pull. And I think cults exploit that desire to, want to do something that has importance. Once, he says tribal societies can teach us about loyalty, belonging, and the eternal quest for meaning. This is a rare and precious sentiment. And I would say cults often position themselves the same way. That's what we're going to give you, This is a chance to kind of create your spiritual family, and he also draws these interesting conclusions, which you just mentioned. One of them, he said, this is why for many people, war feels better than peace. Hardship turns out to be a great blessing. And even disasters are sometimes remembered more fondly than weddings or tropical vacations. And he says, so humans don't mind duress. In fact, they thrive on it. But humans do mind not feeling necessary. And I would say cults exploit that as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Go ahead. And that's what, I thought that's what there was a really interesting way he kind of started into the story, and that's where and this is where he was saying, American Indians lived communally in mobile or semi-permanent encampments that were more or less run by consensus and broadly egalitarian, democratic, classless. Individual authority was earned rather than seized and imposed only on people who were willing to accept it. Anyone who didn't like it was free to move somewhere else. A surprising number of Americans, mostly men, wound up joining American Indian society rather than staying with their own, and the opposite almost never happened. The Indians almost never ran away to join the white society. The immigration always seemed to go from the civilized to the tribal. The intensely communal nature of the American Indian tribe held such an appeal that the material benefits of the Western civilization couldn't necessarily compete with. So I think that's a really fascinating thing to look at. So just that part, I'd be curious to get the ATAC perspective on what that says to you.
How much time have we got?
Yeah.
Because this is an absolutely fascinating topic. I a few months ago read Graeber and Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything.
Oh, cool.
And Graeber was an anthropologist, and Wengrow is an archaeologist, and they spent 10 years. I mean, Graeber is well known for bullshit jobs, pointing out that 30 to 40% of all of the jobs that people do in our society are a complete waste of time. And we could actually, as John Maynard Keynes said in the 30s, by the 1960s, people will only have to work 15 hours a week. We would only have to work 15 hours a week if we didn't have so many bullshit jobs. But that's another subject. And they spent the time, it's called A New History of Humanity. And they basically challenge, such pundits as Yuval Harari and Jared Diamond, and say, well, they haven't really understood history,
right.
And here we are, and they show that rather than there being this kind of Victorian notion of a progression and evolution towards the perfection of capitalist society in the end of history, in fact, there have been many, many, many different forms of society, some of which have been very successful. I mean, I've for a long time have been interested in the Indus Valley civilization, which is in modern day Pakistan, Mohenjo-Daro,
Okay.
which flourished for 700 years without priests, temples, kings, and appears to have been truly egalitarian, a truly democratic society. They also existed without warfare for 700 years. A human tribe of some size. It would appear that in the Ukraine, and sadly archaeological digs have stopped in the Ukraine for interesting reasons, but it would appear there was a similar society there for quite some time that was peaceful. And so that notion of the warrior culture, but they point towards that huge change in Western civilization that happened, which we call the Enlightenment. With people like Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau is usually put at the beginning of it. And they show that this movement in thought seems to have been most influenced by somebody from the First Nations. I'm told I'm meant to say First Nations, not Native Americans, not American Indians, what have you, but it's hard to be politically correct these days. I mean no harm by whatever expression I give.
Exactly. Yeah, I know.
But the Algonquin up on the East Coast, the opponents, of course, of the Iroquois, we have the last of the Mohicans. The Mohicans were Algonquin, and the Mohawk who wiped them out were Iroquois. But there was an Algonquin called Candirong who seems to have tremendously influenced Western thinking. And the great surprise for them when they met Europeans, apart from the fact that they were dirty and they smelled, which is talked about with the conquistador, why would you want to have anything to do with these stinking people who sleep in their clothes? So that's a thought, that was Cortés when he was trying to persuade people to get together and attack the Aztec, which they talk about. But Candirong says, well, there's something we really don't understand. We are really good towards the members of our own tribe. We won't hurt our own tribe. You're abusive and awful to each other. On the other hand, if you're not a member of our tribe, we will torture you to death quite happily. And enjoy it. The women join in. It's all a big family occasion, torturing opponents. But this idea of the tribe, which I think we talk about individualism as being a European American view, whereas Asians have this thing about the family. If you can earn back your family's pride by committing suicide in Japan, harakiri or a seppuku, because you have taken honor back to the family. You have absolved the family of the guilt that the shame that you've created. I think that's a bit extreme. So I'm definitely not advocating. But there is this idea of community, and that the Western communities became fragmented, authoritarian, sectarian. So, one of the great arguments that was roaring over with the invasion of Turtle Island, which I'm told is the proper name for America. What am I supposed to call it? What's the politically correct term? Turtle Island. It's a very big island,
I would say so.
Continent, and why turtles? Why not terrapins? Or is this discriminating against tortoises in some way? It's all very difficult stuff to deal with. But we have this society where, yes, you have some nomadic warrior peoples. The Apache are pretty ruthless people who come down from Alaska at about the same time that Europeans are invading and end up raiding the Pueblo peoples, the Hopi and so on. So you have some fixed communities that are very pacifistic and very quiet. And then you have, I wrote a play, which nobody wanted, about the Ponca, who were these people who found themselves attacked by both the Lakota, the so-called Sioux, and the Cheyenne, because they were an agricultural people. And they managed to fight off these people, but then the great white father decided he was going to send them to Oklahoma. And there was a fascinating court case, which one band of the Ponca won, so they were able to go home. That was in about 1875. And then it was determined by the US Congress that they were not people, So from now on, they were children, and the white people were the guardians of
Oh
the
my
first
goodness.
peoples. And I think it was about 50 years that
That's
that was the
outrageous.
case.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, then, some of them got incredibly rich because they were on land that had oil in it, and they had to be wards of white people to get the money. And something, a wonderful book, Killers of the Flower Moon, I think it's called, which details the first major FBI case, which was where white people were killing off tribal people in the hope that they could inherit and take over, and they got away with it largely. So fascinating things where these cultures collide, and the tremendous differences in them. That you're talking about initiations, and we still have the bar and bat mitzvahs in the Jewish faith.
Right.
We still have confirmation in the Christian faith. But when you compare it to what the Aborigines do, which is scaring the living daylights out of 13-year-olds with bull roarers and all sorts of things like that, and there's a little bit of scarification can go on, it can get quite unpleasant. That of how do I become a man? What does a man represent?
Right.
I'm thinking about Thomas Berger and Little Big Man, which I rewatched that film every couple of years, and I read Berger's amazing book, and he really did study the Plains people to understand, and so many things in their culture that they accept that are transsexual, that a man can, a warrior can actually have 5 wives, one of whom is a man biologically, but you don't have to go through the initiation. You don't have to, but to be a brave, the European term for it, you have this, there are acts of courage. There's cutting coup where you're in a battle where you're striking people, but not actually hurting them, but counting coup rather. How many times you manage to strike the person, and
right.
There's then you have something like, say, A Man Called Horse, the movie, which is accurate. Yes, there was a situation where Sitting Bull, the great medicine man and chieftain of the Lakota, he was unable to attend a battle because he had inflicted 118 wounds upon himself, as part of his religious belief. And you have also the great Crazy Horse, the man who was only ever injured by people coming behind him, the cavalry, and ultimately he went under a truce flag, a parley flag, and was murdered by U.S. cavalrymen. And he's they're incredible. For me as a boy, these were these are heroes. These figures of tremendous valor. Looking at it a bit more deeply, these are not cultures that I think we need to understand. It's almost as if every culture has a piece of the puzzle, and we've brought together the wrong pieces. The warrior culture, which should be a positive and affirmative thing in the defense. And I have met soldiers who really did have this ethic, that they had become soldiers because they wanted to defend people. But most of the soldiers I've met, that's not. They wanted to go out and beat people up after they got drunk, which is not necessarily as honorable. So, what else? I made so many notes while you're talking.
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting because, the other thing he brought up, at this point in the book, he says the Puritan leaders of New England found it particularly galling that anyone would turn their back on the Christian society. So these people leaving, and an early Puritan named, which interesting name, Increase Mather.
Yeah, they call things like prosperity and
charity. Exactly. So Increase Mather complained in a tract called Discourse Concerning the Danger of Apostasy. How do you say that? It's defection, apostasy. That word?
Apostasy or apostasy?
Apostasy. That's apostasy. So it's defection or abandonment. I looked it up.
Leaving your faith.
And he spent his entire life combating and criminalizing anyone who had any sort of relaxation of the Puritanic moral code. And, and obviously cults do that same sort of thing. You set up the rules and you are just going to be crucified if you don't follow the rules. But then when it comes to this movement between the civilization and the tribal community, he said it was really a feudal battle. The nature of the frontier was it kept expanding beyond the reach of the church and state, and out there and on the fringes, people tended to do what they wanted. And so that was a very appealing to a lot when you've got a very structured, controlled environment. And I think, what's so interesting, the way the seduction into a cultic environment, very often people do feel they've been possibly constrained by whatever environment they grew up with, and they're looking at the cultic situation as an opportunity to be relieved of that, and they end up joining another controlled, kind of oppressive society under the guise that they're going to be, it's kind of like, we're promising you that we're going to pull you out of the matrix, but this new society you're going to be in is going to be even more controlled.
It's a green pill.
Yeah, exactly. But as far as like how the hook works, that's the temptation that they're and I think it's the same thing like you're talking about. It's really easy to kind of create a fantasy around these Native American, First Nation tribes, whatever, that they had all these but they were also very, my God, violent, and like you said, the torture was a huge thing. Like they would do horrible things to each other. So it can't just be whitewashed into some beautiful thing, and that's all it was, because there were also some atrocities being done. But I think the way cults kind of position this kind of tribal sentiment of what they're creating, this spiritual family, it's very much based on a lot of those positive attributes that you would describe a tribal culture by, where this, like the idea of a commune is very much a tribal community, right? I mean, we all own everything. It's just like that society that you were talking about in Pakistan. I mean, they're doing all of that, without wars and with people getting along for hundreds of years. So it can happen. So I think as a temptation, it really is something that obviously I don't think you're conscious of it when someone's presenting it to you, but upon the presentation of it, it has an inherent appeal, because the idea of being, moving towards a sense of freedom from something that you're initially perceiving your current situation as being very constrained or even imprisoned, that's going to be something that's going to get people to be interested. And once, like anything, once you got the first hook in, the second one goes in a lot easier. As they say, once you said yes, it's much easier to say yes again and much harder to say no. And
very much so, yeah.
That's just the way.
I don't think it's true, but as Cat Stevens and Rod Stewart said, the first cut is the deepest. In terms of cuts, probably not. But once you've, it's like, if you do something wrong and bad, then the next time it will be easier, unfortunately, because there will be no struggle with your conscience anymore. You've now done the awful thing. I think, at the center of everything is the authoritarian notion that people who believe they should be worshipped and that they are perfect in their understanding, who want to stand above us and piss on us, basically, and people who want to be pissed on, that we have leaders who believe themselves to be divine in some way, that they should have authority over us, that we should do as we're told, and any idealist can become an ideologue. So they shift from having some ideal that they want to represent to then enforcing that. I presume
that's a very, very powerful statement you're just saying. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And it would increase Mather. You say he was called?
Increase Mather, yeah, exactly.
He's probably Cotton Mather's dad or something. So the more famous Mather, who was also a horrible Puritan. And this, where tribalism is opposition, I mean, the first statement that a Cherokee that is recorded as making to a Spaniard was, our people exist to fight war. That's what we're here for. And you then, Frederick Engels, who funded Karl Marx and was a co-author of various things with Karl Marx, put forward the notion, which is still parroted by Marxists, that the Iroquois were this wonderful society because they're a matriarchy. And I think that is an example for us all. They were a matriarchy.
Yeah.
And the torture among Iroquois, I read the Commissioner for Indian Affairs around about 1900 wrote the first examination of the Iroquois people. And it's fascinating. I mean, I was besotted with these people. They're really quite fascinating. And obviously, there was a high degree of intelligence there, which is something that tends to be, well, we Europeans are the intelligent ones, you know, not really,
Yeah.
not really at all. But the descriptions of torture in that book, you know, so you take you've captured an opponent and
Right.
you tie him up and you chop a piece of his flesh off and you roast it and you feed it to him. And if he won't eat it, you torture him some more. And you're going, well, I don't think we should emulate that aspect of Iroquois society.
Exactly.
And that's a matriarchy. That's totally run by women. So the idea of men versus women, which is so current in Western society, I do not see that at all. That there are people who, you know, Indira Gandhi sterilizing loads of people, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher. It's not about being male or female. It's about having attributes of care and concern, which we tend to find more in women than in men. But it's those good attributes and how we can nurture that.
Exactly. Well, you know, and he actually mentions some of these torture techniques in the book, and he says, people being disemboweled and tied to a tree by their own intestines.
That's always fun, though, isn't it? You know, especially on a Friday evening when you've had a few to drink.
You know, blistered over a slow fire. You know,
yeah, it's
hacked to pieces and fed to the dogs.
Mm.
In the Spanish, you know, in the Spanish Inquisition, infidels were buried alive, broken on the rack, sawed in half lengthwise from the crotch, or impaled.
If Goya's to be believed, yes. There is a picture
or impaled slowly on a wooden stake from the anus to the mouth.
Yeah, always a good. Yeah. But they didn't have the movies, did they? You know, so they had to do something when they were bored. It's said that Voltaire. I've read that Voltaire was the first person to complain about institutionalized torture in the European states. And of course, hanging, drawing, and quartering meant that you'd be hung at the beginning of the day until you couldn't really, you know, you wouldn't be killed. And then you'd be drawn, your intestines would be pulled out of you and they'd be burned in front of you. And then at the end of the day, you'd be quartered, which would be when you were finally killed.
Oh, right. When they take the 4 courses, right? And
they chop that's spread eagling, which is a Viking punishment. You see, we've got the wrong torture set here. Quartering was done with an axe, I believe, but I'm sure one of our viewers will have done it and will be able to describe the technique exactly. But this was something that people went out to go and see. And as I say, with the Iroquois or the Algonquin, this was a family affair. I mean, the women were involved in doing this also.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, and I think that's what's important to include, that, you know, again, you can't look at this tribal concept and think, oh, well, it's just all rainbows and gumdrops. It all sounds great. But the way it gets used, I certainly know, like within my group, is this idea of community, and he actually talks about it a lot in the book about how in a more tribal environment, there's much less mental health issues. And very often it's tied to the fact that there's this sense of community that's engaged in a cause together. That tends to suppress a lot of the mental issues you have when you're very individualized, like we talked about in society, and you're feeling a lack of purpose and you don't have a place in your community. That leads to all sorts of mental problems. So the fact that you have a very clear-cut, definitive role within this community tends to curb a lot of the mental health, which I thought was really interesting.
That role may be that you're the idiot, that you're the person who is denied certain rights, who's laughed at, who's, you know, which was, again, a commonplace in European society. Visiting the Prado in Madrid, and seeing the amazing, incredible Velasquez room where he's got the dwarfs, the men of pleasure, and the cretins, and they're portraits of these people who would amuse the king by being dwarfs, men of pleasure. I'm not really sure what that means, and cretins, deformed idiots.
Oh, right.
And they're incredible portraits. I mean, just one of the greatest painters of all time. But you see that was the idea that, you know, in our notions of political correctness and wokeness at the moment, it is right that we're looking at, you know, we shouldn't be calling people ugly and fat, and those sort of things. And these societies, you knew your place in them often. So it was not necessarily a tolerant and pleasant thing. But yeah, as you say, depression doesn't seem to exist outside of industrial society. And I think part of that is also that industrial society created a situation where there are always those at the fringe of the society who can't make ends meet. The last year or so, I've been reading a lot about slavery, because of the notion that we should be paying reparations to somebody or other for slavery. Our Labour Party, New Labour, as they think.
Oh, they've got this in California right now. I believe the latest bill is like they want to give each individual who qualifies, I think it's like $3.4 million and 40 acres of land.
Yeah. And how do you qualify? Because genetically, and this is a horror, and I don't like it, but I have no slaver's blood in me. I can trace my ancestry back, and you know, since modern slavery began with Christopher Columbus, none of my ancestors were involved in this. I very much doubt there are many African Americans who can say that, because sadly their ancestors were raped by slave keepers. But the other part of that was looking at the conditions for anybody and everybody, and I've been reading around that. And there's a wonderful book by Linda Holley called Captives, a historian, and she's talking about the experience of English and then British people, the amount who were taken as slaves. I mean, about 1 million white Europeans were taken as slaves by the Arabs. Corsairs used to raid the south coast of Britain and take whole villages off and sell them off. They also took far more Africans over the years than were shipped to the Americas. 10 to 15 million were shipped to the Americas, appalling. But 14 to 18 million were taken by the Arabs. The Arabs are not going to have to pay any reparations because they castrated the men. So they have no descendants.
Wow.
We then look at the conditions, say, for British soldiers in India and sepoys, native soldiers. It was forbidden to use the lash on them, whereas British soldiers were whipped to death in some occasions. They were also, of course, none of them were expected to fulfill their 20-year term and get home. They would die while they were there.
It was pretty accepted that you would not survive your term?
Yeah. Very, very few, if any, infantrymen returned home. There was no leave. You weren't allowed that. And the conditions were horrific. If you then take a look at, I mentioned Friedrich Engels, he was an industrialist, which is how he was able to fund Marx. And there's a snappy title, The Condition of the Working Classes in Manchester in 1844, which, as I've said elsewhere, should be a Bee Gees album. They did a song called New York Mining Disaster 1850, you know, so I think that would be a great title if anybody wants to resurrect the Bee. There's only one of them left, isn't there now? But Engels is talking about conditions in 1844 in Manchester, in this country, that are every bit as bad as the conditions in which slaves were being kept. So we get to a really difficult situation, which is that what we would like to change is this: there are more slaves in the world today than ever before. There are as many slaves in India today as were traded to the Americas through the whole 200-year period of slavery. There are 14 million slaves in India. We don't even have sanctions against India. We're trading with them. you know.
So how does a slave get, like, who owns a slave in India? Like, I'm not even familiar how this works.
Oh, if a family want a maid, and um, I am related to an Indian family because one of my sons is married to a lovely, very smart Indian woman. And
Right.
so I've talked with her directly about this, and it's like, yeah, you can buy somebody,
For
and
life.
yeah, there you own them then, and you can treat them the way you want to treat them. The courts won't do anything to protect them. There are 40 million slaves in the world today.
I'm not aware of that. I don't think people are aware of that.
And that's
I
the
mean,
United Nations figure, by the way. It's not,
wow.
and it's gone up 5 million in the last 10 years. Why don't we look at creating a society without slavery, a society without poverty, without starvation, and start looking at, you know, I think enough money was spent on the Y2K bug I recently
Yeah.
read to actually feed all of the poor people in the world for a year or something.
Oh, with everyone buying generators and storing food and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, instead of somebody going, I'll tell you what, we'll write a chip that's a year ahead and see if it falls over when 2000 happens. You know, it's not a difficult problem to solve. But I read that $400 billion was spent on that. If you then
Wow.
look at the $1 trillion spent on the Iraq war, that these vast expenses, and rather than, you know, of course, we could say huge amounts of money have been poured into Africa,
Right.
to the new democracies in Africa, and so much of that money went into Swiss bank accounts led
Right.
by, you know, terrible people like, you know,
Sure.
Mugabe. And so it's a matter of how do we create an equitable society rather than a society where white males such as you and I are guilty for what was done by our great grandparents. And in my case, it wasn't done by my great
Yeah.
grandparents.
Yeah.
How do we balance that out? We have a BBC reporter called Laura Trevelyan, who is now, you know, she and her family, realizing that they're in the book, they've given £100,000 to Grenada, and they've apologized. Well, the book is, in this country, in 1807, the slave trade was abolished, and the British Navy, the West Africa Squadron, was sent out to stop slavers. Largely Brazilian slavers and American slavers at that time. The US actually followed suit and banned the trade not so long afterwards, but you could still own slaves and breed them. And so in 1834, 33, 34, in Britain, that the whole slavery itself was abolished. Now, it had been abolished in the 18th century. You couldn't have a slave in Britain. That was illegal, but you could have them in the West Indies. And there are all sorts of interesting cases around that. But so in 1834, it was determined that there should be no more slaves. And it's worth saying that outside of Denmark, nearly every other country in Europe resisted this. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French particularly, actually were doing all sorts of deals to keep running slaves. Then, of course, South America broke away from Portugal and Spain,
Right.
and they
Right.
kept on doing it. But in 1838, it was decided to buy all of the slaves from British owners. And there is a book that lists how much was paid to every individual. It's the largest amount of compensation ever paid by the British government. The loan taken for it, I think, finished being paid in 2002, taken in 1838. And people say, well, but the slaves got nothing. And that's fair enough. That is a fair complaint. But they did get their freedom. They were offered travel back to Africa, to Liberia and Sierra Leone, which turned out to be nightmare countries. And it's worth putting into the account that if compensation had not been paid, they would not have been released. Because, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to send the British Army to kill the slave owners in the West Indies, and we're not going to get any more sugar. You know, what's going to happen?
Right. Right.
the complexity of this question, as with so much of this awful. A friend of mine a few months ago, a really smart friend of mine, shocked me by telling me he was woke. And I said, why? He said, well, because if you're not woke, you're fascist. And it was like, oh, so we're into this good and
Yeah,
evil, black and white dichotomy. I don't
exactly.
believe this. I won't live that way. And I
Yeah,
won't be held guilty and accountable for something I didn't do.
exactly. No, it's the same old all or nothing, my way or the highway. If you're not on my side, then you're the opposite. It's yeah, it's as old as time and so destructive. Yeah,
And it's cultic. It's,
it is. It's completely cultic. That's why, and we talked about it a lot in our other talks. The shades of gray is so important. To look at it and recognize. I actually had a conversation recently with someone about this whole idea of evil, and I said, "Listen, I, I, I think you get into semantics about a lot of this, but I said it's not that I have an issue with describing that someone's acts of cruelty could be described as evil, but to say like evil exists as if outside, like there's good and evil. I said, come on. I said it's clearly there's a myriad of stuff in between. It's a much more complex issue than just, oh, it's evil and it's good. I can't go down there. But that's what the cult taught me, that black and white thinking. So yeah, I mean, we both obviously that's like ding ding ding, the red flag goes up. And it's fascinating to just kind of think about how that is so prolific and still to this day. And just what you're saying, that, and you didn't, and not even knowing that what you told me about what's happening in India, but then I am aware of course, the underground crime world of the sex slaves, and people are literally still buying people for as a sexual toy, so to speak. And
in the US of A.
Yeah, yeah, and apparently I've heard, like on the dark web, you can literally go order whatever type of person you want, age, shape, color, hair color, whatever. It's unbelievable.
And
And
there's a
that
tremendous
is,
amount of agricultural slavery. Far more people are being traded as laborers and find
mhm,
themselves, we have a tremendous influx of Albanians into this country. And of course, at
yeah,
the other end of the deal, modern slavery, human trafficking, they're being told you'll have this wonderful new life. Once you join our cult, everything will be
yeah,
fantastic. And then they get here, they don't have a passport, and they can't
right,
complain about being paid $2 a week. We had a
yeah,
case of some man who'd been kept in a shed for sort of 30 years or something. So even here, where there is a fair amount of policing and concern, we fall down.
still
And
have it, yeah,
and I think putting the attention on the kind of twittering machine. I'm going to use Paul Clay's term for it, not Twittersphere. The twittering machine, where you've got this many words to say how much you hate the person you're attacking. All
yeah,
that anger, all that rage, if you can't have a conversation with somebody, you've become a fanatic. If your emotions overwhelm you to such an extent that you need to insult and attack people rather than converse with them, you've become a fanatic. And that's what a cult member is. That's somebody who's, they can't sit and reason it through. I've had situations where I sat with people whose view of the world I thoroughly and absolutely disagreed with. And I've talked with them and they've changed their minds. That's happened to me throughout my life. And I'm
yeah,
very pleased about that. I had a
yeah,
guy who told me he hadn't talked to his sister for 2 years because she was a druggie. And when I said, what's the drug? Expecting, heroin, crack, cocaine, whatever,
right,
he said cannabis. And I said, so you haven't talked to her for 2 years. And we sat, and as he drank 5 whiskeys,
mm,
and I was drinking orange juice at the time, we talked about drugs. And I said, well, there's a differentiation between hard and soft drugs. A hard drug
right,
is an addictive drug. A soft drug, like
right,
cannabis, is not
right,
addictive. If you give up coffee, then you'll get a headache because it's a
right,
hard drug. It's an addictive
right,
drug. And from behind the bar, it's late at night, we're in a tiny hotel and forgotten she was there. The barkeep said, my husband stopped drinking coffee last week and he's had a headache all week. I said, there you go. the next day, and I said, and what you're drinking there is a hard drug. At Scotch, it's a hard drug, alcohol.
Right.
The next day, he found his sister. Now, if I'd taken the attitude that I see so frequently around me, saying, "You're an idiot, not believing what I believe. I've got a megaphone and you can F off," we wouldn't really have got anywhere.
Right.
And seeing that, and the rise of the hard right, as we're now beginning to call them, the fundamentally Nazism on the one side, and on the other side, this, I was very interested to find that in the US in, I think, 1882, there was the Chinese Immigration Act, and it forbade Chinese people from immigrating to the United States. Anybody else could do it, but we don't want any more Chinese. And one of the groups that rose up against the Chinese was the American Socialist Party. So the idea that there's right and left, no, that's good and evil. That's black and white. There isn't right and left. And there aren't just shades of gray. There are lots and lots, tens of thousands of colors as well.
Oh yeah, of course. Yes, of course.
And to try and understand things in those terms and say, it's like people who say they're patriots, but they'd quite happily kill anybody that voted Democrat or Republican or what have you. It's like, they're not patriots. They are members of a cult group that will oppress other people. So I think the first condition is to have compassion for our species, for humanity in general, and to push away this idea of that there are different races or different, we're all the same species. There is one race of human beings. It's our weakness, because it means, like the Cavendish banana, and there's only one species of banana too, we are vulnerable. Whereas, beetles, tens of thousands of different beetles, you might wipe one out, but the others all persist. And until we recognize that unity, that family connection, that tribal connection that we share, which many people have talked about in the past. Charlie Chaplin said he was a patriot for all mankind. I think Einstein pretty much said the same. While we're still saying, well, you're Jewish, or you're Muslim, or you're atheist, or you're black or yellow, or what have you, we are totally missing the point about the future of our species, because we are going to make the planet a very difficult place to live as long as we foment this hatred and put aside reasoning just because of how strong our feelings are.
Right. And because you look differently, or you believe something differently than I do. And that's enough. It's as obvious as in the culture of dogs. They all came from the wolf. Yeah. And yet you've got all this myriad of different breeds out there now. And yet we all know they're dogs, and that they all arrived from kind of a single kind of species that then mushroomed into all these varieties. So how's it any different for the humanity?
Yeah. And we get to natural selections, we get to sexual selection, where you've got the choice. There's a study with birds of paradise, where they normally have an 18-inch tail, this particular species, and they cut one of them in half and they stuck it on another one. And they followed 3 birds through the breeding season. So one of them's got this poor 9-inch tail. One's got an 18-inch tail, and one's got a 27-inch tail. And he got a lot more tail than the others got. And you go, now, if birds of paradise are that stupid, that, what's what we want? Oh, we want a huge tail. And human beings, of course, you get a group who want particular attributes. And that could be pointy teeth, which are black, and not talking about the Inuit tradition here. It could be any damn thing. Right. And the point is that in looking at humanity, I see that there are tribal groups. There was a swap done, in the old days of anthropology, when you could do evil and wicked things. Right. They took, I think, 2 people each from 2 tribal groups in the Amazon. One group known for its pacifistic ways, and the other, pretty hardcore. Yeah. And they swapped them over, and they found that the people that they swapped over became like the culture that they joined. So so much is, it's not necessarily genetic. It's not necessarily written into us that we have to
Right.
be horrible.
It,
There's
yeah.
a lot that's cultural. That's, you know, if you have a good system of justice and a good educational system, we can, but we don't. You know,
Right.
we
Oh,
haven't.
it's the nature versus nurture argument, right? I mean, all of that, and the element of peer pressure and the idea of conforming, to fit in, the survival of the species.
And given then
Yeah,
epigenetics, and that, you know, as our friend Yuval Noah says, genes are not read only. You know, Richard
yeah.
Dawkins is utterly wrong about that, as Yuval's mentor, Eva Jablonka, has shown.
We were talking about what kind of society would really work,
Mm.
and one of the things this guy Junger talked about, he goes, the temptations of the native life, one of the most compelling might have been the fundamental egalitarianism, which we've talked about, right? Private property was limited to whatever could be transported by horse or foot. So gross inequalities of wealth are very difficult to accumulate. Social status for men came through hunting and war, which they all had access to. Women had far more autonomy and sexual freedom. Because of these basic freedoms, tribal members tended to be exceedingly loyal. They never experienced treason against the tribe, and cowardice was punished by death. It
Mm.
was a simple ethos that promoted loyalty and courage among over all virtues, and considered preservation of the tribe almost a sacred task. And so I think those elements again are what are very appealing to as an antidote to what we experience in our normal lives, and cults tend to promote themselves somewhere quite often. My group was somewhere around that, this kind of alternative lifestyle to what you grew up in, and it's very often painted like that was the wrong way and this is the right way, right? It's in that black and white way of thinking, and that's the matrix, and we're pulling you out of that. And I think that it's helpful for someone who has this curiosity and wondering, like, how do you get pulled into that. I think, as we're saying, there's a lot of values that get represented in that kind of idealized form of a tribal community that you can exploit someone, because you would want things to be better handled that way, and the fact that there could be an even playing field and people really did pull together to help out one another. Unfortunately, those are the hooks on the way in, and that's not generally how it ends up proving to execute in real life as it plays out. But that's why I say to a lot of people, it's very often a bait and switch scenario. I will never beat myself up for what I signed up for and the pitch that I bought into. Now, what it actually was that I got involved with was something vastly different, and it only took me 20 years to figure that out, but I did, and I'm grateful for it. But I think it helps explain how it happens. And the other part he brought up, he said, so why was Western society so unappealing? And on a material level, it's clearly more comfortable and protected from the hardships of the natural role. But as societies become more affluent, they tend to require more than less time and commitment from the individual. And it's possible that many people feel that affluence and safety simply aren't a good trade for freedom. So I think that's a really interesting point, right? It's like, we all talk about all the wonderful, material acquisitions you can in Western, or civilized world. But then when someone says, well, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't measure someone by the kind of car they drove or the house they live in or the clothes they wear, and that there was, and I think that's, again, a certain appeal. It's like, if you're seeking a spiritual life where you're not, there's this kind of pushback on the material world as far as like what it represents, and pursuing things that are far more ego driven rather than something that's more kind of humanity driven, as we're describing, then you can make a very valid argument. And that's how it says the early humans would most likely have lived in nomadic bands of around 50 people, which is, my group was around 50 to 100 people. They would have been utterly intolerant of hoarding or selfishness. They would have done almost everything in the company of others, and they almost would have never been alone. So it's a give and take. You're giving up your privacy, but then you've got a community. And I think these are all certain things that play factors into why people get involved in groups like you or I got involved with. It's not clear cut, but it certainly, I think it helps explain how we find ourselves in, what triggers they push that made it appealing to consider this lifestyle that ends up unfortunately not playing out so well, but in its idealistic form, it sounded pretty interesting as an alternative to what we grew up with.
Yeah, and I think a very serious dynamic. I think that the view that is being presented there is of nomadic tribes. It's not
Right.
of, say, the Pueblo peoples, who had a pretty successful society and could accumulate wealth. But it's a matter of, we're children of the 60s. What came before us was the hippie idea, which is the very entitled kids who anticipated that everything would be given to them on a plate, who were born to people who had suffered through the horrors of war.
2 world wars. Yeah, right.
I mean, my father served for 7 years, from 1939 through to 1946. He was there at Dunkirk.
Wow.
And saw what happened there. He was there at Normandy. Wow. And he was there at the liberation of Belsen. And so having kids, the political statement made by Harold Macmillan, our prime minister, was, you never had it so good. And it happened to be true when you look back at the squalid housing, the awful conditions of the period between the wars, and the transition that happened afterwards, that we do have a more prosperous society, sadly, to some extent, because of denuding the third world of the oppression against people there, and the profits made and poured into the Western countries. But the idea with the hippies was we're going to have peace and love. We're not going to fight war anymore. There's going to be a lot of free love, which something I'm kind of glad I didn't ever get involved with. Whatever. But somehow the world is going to produce stuff and we're going to get it. And out of that came some very positive and good communes, which, have origins in the 19th century in the US, where these idealistic ways of life were being developed. So, the Shaker group, for example, who gave us shaker furniture, which costs a fortune, and invented the washing machine, I'm told. But they believed in absolute celibacy. And when they were forbidden from taking children from orphanages anymore, they died out, oddly enough. But there was this sense of self-realization, self-actualization that became so powerful in Western society and lured us into groups that were saying, yes, look at the establishment, look at the horrors of Vietnam, or in this country, in the Malaysian and Borneo campaigns, which were kept very hidden from the British public. But a lot of people died, hundreds of thousands of people. That's the establishment, the cruel, wicked, bad establishment. Let's make, a paradise on earth as hippies. And out of that came the Green Movement, which I think has been a wonderful thing. This year is the 60th anniversary of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, about how bad pesticides and insecticides can be. DDT apparently is not good for us. She was hounded to her death, for writing that book, which is a terrible thing. But it started a consciousness which is now perhaps best represented by Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, if you prefer, who is an incredibly intelligent young woman who's basically, fell into a profound depression at the age of 5 because adults were so stupid. They were destroying the planet, and a 5-year-old could see this. And I'm afraid it is that. And what we have is a society that doesn't want people to grow up. So we live in a cult, a massive cult, where the advertisers want you to be a perpetual adolescent in need of mollifying with new goods and substances. And, believing your status is to do with whether you drive a little red Ferrari or, a Volkswagen or, wherever you are. Now, I think it's a mistake to think that those status ideas didn't exist among the First Nations. And, one of the things, so, for example, the Huichol people, whom I tremendously admire, this is a little Huichol piece here. They disappeared when the conquistador arrived and made themselves remote. They're particularly well known because of peyote, that their religion means they have to gather, and I think they have to walk something like 300 miles to go back to the place where they used to be to get this stuff. And it's expected that traditionally that every member of the Huichol will make their own clothes. So you can see immediately what sort of person you're dealing with. And as somebody who's not tremendously good at sewing, I'd have been in trouble there, especially if you're out on mescaline while you're trying to do it. That would have been really weird.
Exactly.
But there is a way of, and that whole status thing, if we look at the Plains people, that one of the great things is the notion of generosity, that culturally, the fourth element of Evia Blanca's notion of evolution, you have natural selection, sexual selection, epigenetics, but you also have cultural transmission, the fourth dimension, so that a culture can do something that like developments of language, for example, which is not coming out of your genes and is passed on and will affect genetic transmission. And it was considered normal among the Plains people, whoever killed the most buffalo, and it used to be quite hard before they had rifles and horses, I would think, but whoever killed the most buffalo would have to give them all away. You had to, and that was a terrible hindrance culturally when these poor people were shoved into reservations, and white people would come along and say, "Oh, I like the look of your horse," and they'd give it to them because it was a culture of generosity. In the north, where you get to the potlatch cultures like the Tlingit, a beautiful word that is, Tlingit. I love that word. Where they built totem poles and had lodges and all of this. The thing was to give away as much as you could, and whole tribes bankrupted themselves by giving away everything they possibly could. So it can swing a bit too far. We live in a culture where it's a matter of acquiring as much as you possibly can, which is something that would be considered disgusting to the Lakota or the Cheyenne. Absolutely. Right. Why would you want to do that? You're a squirrel and you've collected enough nuts to live for 10 million years, and all around are other squirrels starving. That would be seen as wrong.
Yeah, and exactly.
Maybe rather than, manhood being an aspect of how many people you can knock off horses or shoot with a bow, if we look to what the real virtues are, what should we really be if we were to be great human beings? What would a wonderful human being consist of, and how would they behave? And we have the Christian inference, which is you would sacrifice yourself completely, like St. Francis, who died at the age, I think, of 44 and apologized to the donkey, which is what he called his body, for having abused it by carrying stones up a hill to build a church. And he's, quite a remarkable man, brilliant poet, amazing man. But that idea of not having enough for yourself, also the bit about kissing lepers, I'm not really keen on. I've got nothing against lepers, but, a little bit of distance, I think, there.
Draw a line there, yeah.
So finding out, and that's what growing up is, where you determine what the virtues are as far as you're concerned. And I think that in the Western society, most people don't grow up. They never work out what's good for us, and that they should be compassionate and caring, and yet not in the kind of knee-jerk empathy where I speak as somebody who suffers from the empathy disorder, and I have just my state pension if anybody would like to throw money at me at this point. Because, I want to help people. It makes me feel good, and as one of my brothers pointed out to me when I was a teenager, we only do the stuff that we think is going to be good for us. And it may be being Mother Teresa so that you can be on the TV or around the world or what have you. But so, I chose to do things that seemed helpful to other people. And I'm absolutely happy with that. I would be even more bitter and twisted than I am if I'd not. I'm not bitter and twisted at all. That's not true. So that sense of adulthood is where I decide what the values are, eternal or otherwise, what the virtues are.
Right.
And I don't think that, the Romans thought that adolescence ended, I think, at 32. Adulthood began then, and you might live to be 40. You were lucky. I think that's a bit young. I think, that it's more like after 50, and it shouldn't be. We should be teaching kids to take responsibility and to determine for themselves what the virtues are. What should they be doing? What society do they want to be initiated into? Is it a society where, you have incense and chasubles and thuribles? I don't know what they are, but apparently they're good things. And you sing songs and you praise God and you do all of that stuff? Or is it a society where you care about the people around you and do the best you can to help them? And the planet,
No, I mean, he actually he talks about this as well. He says the mechanism seems pretty simple. Poor people are forced to share their time and resources much more than wealthy people are, and the result is a closer and more interdependent community than the ones the wealth tends to produce. And then he talks about how, these wealthy societies are the ones that have the highest rates of depression, schizophrenia, poor health, anxiety, chronic loneliness, all that sort of thing. And he says the findings are in keeping with the self-determination theory. Are you familiar with that?
No.
I was not either. And it said human beings need three basic things to be content. They need to feel competent about what they do, meaning autonomy. They need to feel authentic in their lives, competent, and then connected to others, community. These values are considered to be intrinsic to human happiness, and they far outweigh the extrinsic values such as beauty, money, and status. So again, I think
good statement.
If you're able, and again, to relate it back to our favorite subject about, how you're trying to kind of seduce someone into a cultic environment, I think very often that's how you're pitching it. This is your chance to have these things. You're going to have a sense of community. You're going to feel authentic. You're going to feel good about what you're doing because you're part of some cause. This is going to be much better than pursuing the average Joe's, beauty, money, status, and position in life. And I think that, there again, it's, I always try to relay to people that it seems to be at almost every case I've talked to, the way people get seduced into these things is by taking their more noble attributes or their more noble perspectives on who they see themselves or how they want to be and use that against someone. And I think
persuade them that they have an invisible enemy inside them that is prohibiting them from achieving these things. And if you just give us enough money, we will fix that for you.
Exactly. So, and he says, as modern society reduced the role of community, it simultaneously elevated the role of authority. And I think that's a really strong statement.
Give me that one again. I was writing a note.
As modern society reduced the role of community, it simultaneously elevated the role of authority.
But just a couple of points. Firstly, the rich live a lot longer than the poor. And the life expectancy, of 40 to 50 would be quite normal in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it's gone up because of the access that wealth gives to medicine and to care and to servants,
Yeah, right, exactly.
And I think those are very valid points, and we get into a little difficulty on status and position. And if we're talking about beauty as an attribute of the self, then that's one thing. But if we're talking about the appreciation of beauty,
yeah, I agree. I think that's an important thing to clarify. Yeah, and I assume I'm assuming, I don't know. I'm assuming when he says beauty, it's more like vanity,
yeah,
it's beauty, money, and status. So I think
yeah, vanity, I think, is a better way to look at
probably,
it, and
probably a
which
better way.
causes depression and desperation among.
And also, I think it's like we're saying, it's not clear cut. It's trying to find within that spectrum where you feel you lie. But I think when you're at a position of vulnerability, and which is where cults tend to prey on people, when you're at a place where you're very undecided as far as these things that we're talking about, as far as what your position is, who you are, what your point of even being here is, all those sort of things, that's when you're most vulnerable. And that's where I think these ideals, which are clearly have validity, can be presented in such a way saying that, well, this is what we'll give you, like, again, for the right amount of money, and things can all make so it tickles that part of our inherent kind of self-identity that I think most of us want to look back in the mirror at someone that kind of represents those things, and so if someone's saying, well, here, I've got the answer how to get there, it's really, really tempting, and if you felt you haven't been exposed to that in any real sense, it can feel like the best day that ever happened. And I try to explain that to people all the time. Like I put it as simply as, I just had no game plan. I felt like I should have one. And I really respected people that had game plans, or people that were super passionate about something. And I hadn't found that yet. So I was incredibly insecure about that. And when I met someone in this case, in my group, Freddie, this cult leader who was really excited about his game plan, and certainly could talk a lot about it, and it certainly sounded a lot better than my no plan. That's where it started. That's where the first kind of screw starts to unloose, and you start under the guise of freeing your mind. You don't realize you're moving into a situation that's actually going to be authoritarian and controlling, but it's being presented as like, no, free. We're gonna free your mind. You're gonna be able to find yourself, your purpose, who you are, what it all means. And it all sounds great. And if I ever write a biography, I think I'll just title it, well, it seemed like a great idea at the time.
Yeah, exactly. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Now I'm not so sure. Part 2.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it started very early on. I was about 13 and I was at school, and very traditional authoritarian school where you got hit if they didn't like what you're doing. You had to wear little caps and blazers and ties and all of that stuff. Best school in the county. And this contradiction really hit me, that we were being told that we were meant to be Christian. We'd sing a song in Latin about God, country, and school. Those are the three things. Pro Deo, Patria, Scholae. And yeah, so we were told that Christian values were the important values, but we were being taught to be rapacious and exploitative. We were being taught to be leaders of industry, and that contradiction, that hypocrisy, struck me very hard. And going, well, this just isn't true. That they are not promoting. Jesus said that he who would follow me must give all he owns to the poor. I didn't see any of that going on. And so the contradiction was just too much. And then there's that sense inside yourself, and I think it'd be good to, for kids to work it out. What do I respect? Do I respect the tough guys, or do I respect the smart guys, or what is it I want to do? I want to be a great chess player, or, what are the values and the virtues? Because what tends to happen is that they kind of unconsciously are there. So when I got involved at 19 with Scientology, I imagined that Ron Hubbard would be the most virtuous of human beings. When I found out that he was a foul-mouthed, intemperate, abusive human being, it was a terrible shock to me, because I'd got him as this kind of calm Buddha who would deal with all situations. But and it was interesting because within a year, I was never a living member, I was really lucky. But within a year of joining, I'd realized that I was projecting what I considered to be the virtues on this man. And I went, no, he's, as he says, he's a human being. He also claimed, of course, to be a decorated war hero, not true, a nuclear physicist, not true, and to have studied with gurus in Tibet, China, India, and Mongolia. I didn't even know there were any gurus in Mongolia. And these are all lies, as I have demonstrated in my work. But I believed he was a great man. I believed that he was somebody who had achieved equanimity. And that was what I wanted. I got involved with Scientology because my girlfriend had left me. She'd run off with, one of our friends, and she was leaving the country. She was going to go and live in New Zealand. And there was some weird deal that she was going to come back in 6 months' time, she said. It was, you're 19 and your heart's broken. And worse of all, in my case, I knew I didn't love her. I think it was just the thought of being abandoned. I'm so nice. How could anybody abandon me? And so I went to this group wanting equanimity. I wanted, when anything horrible happened in life, I wanted to be able to deal with it and not be plowed under emotionally. And sad to say, after 9 years, I had achieved nothing of that. Absolutely nothing of it. And it was only by being harassed for 16 years and, just horrible, the things that happened to me. There's a point where I think I was a named party in 10 court cases, and one will wipe most people out. I was sued in New York. I was sued here. I sued back, which was foolish. Former friends were turned against me, started writing affidavits, all of this stuff. And it was a very, very difficult time. And as we said near the beginning of this conversation, those hardships shaped me. Those hardships led me to a place where, I would still be absolutely and utterly devastated if my wife left me, because I love her completely and utterly. But it doesn't seem very likely. We seem to be getting on pretty well after 3 years. But I most of the things that would have troubled me, I can deal with those now. I do have that equanimity. And I have a certain cynicism that, I don't anticipate that the judicial system will be fair, or the police will follow the law, or, things like this. And with that understanding, I am not as disappointed. My wife asked me what my fundamental trait was, near the beginning of our relationship. And I said amusement. And she thought that was a bad thing, and it's like, no, I will find in the worst situation something that tickles me, gallows humor or what have you, and I'll get through it, as a consequence. But I generally delight in life. I find life amusing. I find ideas and art amusing, and get on with that. Returning to the essential notion of tribalism, that we haven't mentioned Robin Dunbar and the idea that the Dunbar number, that a community of about 150 people works. He also says, and I don't think this is holy writ, I think this should be questioned. He's become very famous because of it. But he also says we can only have 5 close friends, and that's about what we can manage.
I don't know if I buy that one.
No, I find that I have rather more than that. And I'm extraordinarily lucky in that regard. But I think there is something about how a community is made, and that sense that a family extends into a tribe, and that a cult group is a tribe, where, as Yuval Noah says, I think we all know, that the leader becomes the parent, true father in the case of Sun Myung Moon, of course. We become siblings within the group members. And this is the bit where Yuval breaks through and gives us a new idea. The cult becomes the baby. The doctrine becomes the baby. So
Oh,
that if you
yeah.
insult my baby,
Oh, I
we
see.
become totally
Yeah,
protective of that.
that's a great
Um,
way to look at it. That's interesting. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we see that in looking at the Algonquin. We see it in looking at all sorts of communities and cultures. And it's how do I find the tribe I should associate with? I think a lot of people, looking at gender issues. We've just had our prime minister, who's our first Hindu prime minister, which is nice, isn't
Right.
it?
Yeah.
Tell us that you're going to go to the convenience that is the gender you were born as,
Hmm.
and that's going to be the rule now. So if you've had a sex change, then tough. You've got to go to this one. I mean, my wife sort of said, well, why not do what the Europeans do and have unisex toilets, and we'll just get rid of all this nonsense.
Right.
But
Yeah.
what about the 1 in 1,000 people who are born between genders? It's
Right.
not a matter that they want to transition one way or the other. They're actually born with
Right.
mixed.
Right. Right.
Or
Mix.
what,
Mix. Right.
we now got to set up a special toilets for them. But these gender issues, and particularly for transsexual people, I think of one of the good things about the internet, the World Wide Web, is that people can find their tribe. They can
Hmm.
find other people. One of the
Right.
bad things is they can get angry about everybody else, and so
Right. Well, I think that's the potential danger is in trying to seek your tribe, you can in essence get radicalized.
yes,
And again, very kind of I think inherent to human nature, wanting to find your tribe and just not knowing that pursuit of that can be bereft with danger. And I think that's where we want to hope to educate and say, listen, it's natural to have those feelings. It's part of, again, I think goes back the fact that we don't have these rituals and things that kind of segmented our lives in a way of, well, at this point you have to start acting like an adult, and what does that mean? So now that's a whole blurred. And as you said, most of us, in society are still children, even maybe in their 60s and 70s. So this is where that pursuit of the tribe and the unfortunate, the fact that cults are going to continue to exist as long as this is how our society operates. That's just the way it's going to work. This is not going away.
And I think you've just made the essential point of this whole conversation, which is that in seeking a tribe, we are likely to be radicalized. We're likely at first to say, oh, these are my people, and join in. I mean, I remember getting to Scientology, and I was 19, the people at the Scientology mission franchise were in their early 20s. They'd just graduated. They'd all come from Bournemouth, in fact, where they'd graduated. And they were just wonderful people who'd been thoroughly convinced that this is a great idea and it was going to lead to wonderful things. And they, I think there's this idea, firstly, they were all graduates. So the idea of cult members being uneducated or stupid is not necessarily true. And they weren't people who were particularly emotionally vulnerable, I don't think. I think they were quite usual young people who were idealistic. They wanted to do something, and they found themselves in a society that was not and is not doing the right things. And it was very easy to join that tribe. And it's very sad to me to think that all of those people carried on in Scientology after I left. And now, they're all at retirement age. And I imagine that their lives have been horrible as a consequence of them becoming more taken up. But yes, that essential point that you make, that we are likely through our naivety to be drawn into the wrong tribe. And so I think keeping your options open, and one of the most invidious people in our world today is Stefan Molyneux with his Free Domain Radio, and this idea of divorcing yourself from the family of origin, that what's wrong with you is the fact that you grew up in a family. and you've got to get out. I met a woman whose 17-year-old had left a note on the pillow, and she didn't hear from him again because of this insidious idea. And that's the thing to perhaps keep in mind, that to maintain the relationship you have with your friends and with your family, not to lose those things, because that is your tribe. You know, those people are, and you can belong to different tribes. That's one of the great things about the modern world. You can have different values and hang out with different people. Again, I'd agree with Evia Blanca and Yuval that we adopt friends as siblings. You know, that's how I view you. If you had some sort of problem in your life, and I know if I did in mine, we would be there to help each other. And that's a wonderful thing. But we don't have to be confined in an ashram, or, you know, we can have those.
That's right. No, and I think that's just why I think it's such an important topic to kind of address, as we're saying, like this idea that that it can't happen to me for all these reasons, or why does it happen? I think that these are things that are easily answered if addressed in the light of like a conversation we had today. And looking at the benefits of the tribal thing and why that's appealing, then also realize that doesn't mean that's also the answer either. There's an attraction to it for some very valid reasons, but there are also some really horrible things going on in tribal communities. So it's not like that's the ideal to pursue either. But there's this kind of understanding of, well, like you're just saying, we do want to find those people that we feel when we're around them, we're seen and heard, and we feel like there's a kindred spirit in this. It doesn't have to be identical way of thinking, but we all find friends that we enjoy being challenged by. So it's not like, I just have to find my like-minded people and we're all going to come into one funnel way of thinking. But I think when you don't know or haven't found your tribe, and there is a sense of lacking, and I think that's when you're vulnerable.
I think that's true. And on the perhaps finally, because it's come to that time, I think, Carl Gustav Jung, who you found out the last time we talked, I'm not very keen on. I'm sorry about that, if that was a bit. But he said that it was a sad thing that modern man had lost his myth. And people around him said, "What are you talking about? We have exchanged." A human society cannot exist without a myth and without its initiations. So, for example, hazing in American universities is a substitute, and a bloody horrible one, for initiation ceremonies. And we will substitute these things. And so maybe, I think it was yesterday I was talking to Mike Rinder, and I was reminded of being in Cape Town. And my host, who was tremendous, said it was a terrible thing that the African people were losing their traditions and their ways of being. And it had never struck me. I would have agreed with this absolutely. But on that day, I kind of went, so I ought to be doing Morris dancing. I ought to be doing this medieval ritual in a white suit. Surely we need a culture where we can say, the Lakota people don't need to do the sun dance for the benefit of tourists. That isn't really maintaining a tradition. It's actually getting revenue. And that our rituals, and whatever we call them, they are rituals, the things that we go through, which put us into a state of mind. You go into a Catholic church and all the, chasubles and thuribles that we mentioned before, and all of this stuff is going on. That's getting somebody into the state of mind. And so they're feeling euphoric, they're feeling connected to their God, to their idea, by all of the uniforms and all of the music, all of the thing that's going on. And understanding that and going, okay, that's what's happening. How can I determine my own rituals? What is my myth? What are the stories I believe in? And can I be, to some extent, the master of my fate, or the mistress of my fate, not wishing to be sexist? I don't believe we ever do become the captains of our souls. I think that there is a certain amount of the situations around us that has an effect on us one way or another.
Yeah.
But, to what extent can I be in charge of that? And also, as a little rider to this conversation, isn't it a shame that children aren't encouraged to talk about things? Right? Rather than this authoritarian, we've got the facts, we'll tell you,
Right.
because so much comes out in our understanding of ourselves when we have to express ourselves. And so encouraging that, I think, is also something that would make for less cults and less authoritarianism.
No, I completely concur, and I think it's really this type of situation where we self-identify through our belief system. I mean, that kind of like becomes our representative, of who we. But if you're at that point where you're not really sure what you believe, then you're very vulnerable, and that's where you need to be really careful. And that is a natural part of the process, that you're not going to figure out what your belief, especially those teenage years, early 20s. I mean, anytime a life crisis happens, your beliefs are challenged. Your why is this happening now? Where does this play in the bigger picture? So I think
why
we're
is God
constantly,
doing this to me?
yeah, exactly, all of those thoughts that come up.
And at
So
any point of transition, we are vulnerable. It
yeah,
can be a very positive thing, a new job, a new country, a new place,
right.
new people. It's as if we run on tram lines, and
Yeah,
anything that changes in our rituals, our habits, our routines, whatever you want to call them, makes us vulnerable to change. And when somebody comes along and love bombs us and tells us how absolutely wonderful we are, then asks for money, the answer is, I don't know you, go away.
right, exactly.
Leave me
Exactly.
alone. Or when's the last time you talked to your mum? That's the lovely question that Steve hasn't to have solved.
There you go. Exactly. That's a better question to ask.
Oh.
Well, as always, John, I love that there's actually more. We'll tackle something else the next time, because he gets into PTSD and the soldiers, and also how like the Blitz. He uses the Blitz as a great example of, they were so worried about how people would behave once the bombing happened, and there would be total anarchy. But the truth was, because the rich and the poor were all getting bombed, that people actually came together in this sense of community, and actually really, they didn't need police or anything. People were just incredible, the way, like, and how disasters bring out some of our better human nature that you would see in a real community. And so, of course, then once the danger is gone, people retreat back to their camps. But it is interesting to see that, given that, and he actually references even disaster movies to show that's what we always have, something horrible happening, and that's what it takes for us to kind of rise up and be the good guy, and it's fascinating.
I mean, the Blitz is incredible, because you have mass observation functioning there, and I'm not sure that anything like it has existed. And it started in the 30s, where sociologists were collecting the diaries of ordinary people. And so we have such a window on that period, where at first you have Winston Churchill saying, you can't go down into the underground and use it as shelter, and the people just saying, sod you, and did it. And then you had that, as you say, that fear that there would be a kind of neurotic collapse among the people. And in fact, people just normalized it. Said, oh yeah, we've been bombed again. So, I mean, my mum was, lived through aerial bombardment. What a thought,
Yeah. So we'll chat about that maybe the next time. That'd be fun.
Yeah, we'll resolve those issues next time.
Exactly.
And
always great to see you.
likewise.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. And thank you for watching, listening, and
Yes,
please
everyone,
take part.
Yes, please. Look forward to hearing everyone's comments. We got some very nice comments the last time from our conversation, which is very great. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's getting more and more. And I used to, sadly, I don't have the time to answer all the comments, and I apologize for that, because there are so many of them now. And so many people are, when I feel sort of disheartened about the time we put into doing this, it's always refreshing that so many people are so kind about what we're doing. But that now the situation is that comments are being answered by other people. So I don't have to answer them.
There
Spike
you
doesn't
go.
have to answer them. That people are having conversations, and
That's what that's the ideal. When I mean, I think it's all about fostering conversation, improving communication, and I think that's the best case scenario. I love hearing that that's happening. That's great.
Yeah, and we are in the the danger of being considered to be gurus, and I just want to make it really clear that we're not, that we're fallible human beings, and very glad to be corrected, and as long as it's nicely done.
Yeah.
Don't want to be insulted too profoundly, and that does happen occasionally in the comments. Apparently I don't know anything about politics, somebody was saying, which is probably true. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, and I don't live in America, so how would I know about politics?
I don't know if I ever want to learn too much about politics.
Yeah, it's shady business is what I've learned. But okay, it's been great as ever, and we'll do it again soon.
Until the next time, John.
Yeah, cheers, Hoyt.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.